Cultivate writing skills to reach non-specialist audiences. And we're delighted to have with us Dr. David Weintraub, Dr. Paul Kramer, and Mr. Bill Snyder for this panel discussion. Dr. David Weintraub is a professor of astronomy, director of undergraduate studies in the Department of Physics and Astronomy, and director of the program in communication of science and technology at Vanderbilt. His book projects include How Old is the Universe, published in 2011, and his book Religion and Extraterrestrial Life, How Will We Deal with It, was published in 2014, and his recent work, Life on Mars, What to Know Before We Go, is forthcoming. Dr. Paul Kramer is a professor of history at Vanderbilt. His primary research interests are in modern U.S. history with an emphasis on transnational, imperial, and global histories, American social thought, and the politics of inequality. His first book, The Blood of Government, Race, Empire in the United States and the Philippines, explores the imperial politics of race-making between U.S. and Philippine societies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Professor Kramer also writes for The New Yorker and Slate on themes relating to the history of the United States and the world. And he is currently writing a methodological book on the transnationalizing of U.S. history and a book on the intersections between immigration policy and U.S. foreign relations. Mr. Bill Snyder is a science writer with 40 years of experience covering healthcare and biomedical science for universities and daily newspapers. He began work as a science writer at Stanford University Medical Center News Bureau in 1978. He followed that with 22 years working for dailies, including Nashville's afternoon newspaper, the Nashville Banner, and the Tennessean. Since 2002, he has covered biomedical science for Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Currently, he writes for The Reporter, the medical center's weekly newspaper, and also for other publications, including Vanderbilt Medicine, the Medical School Alumni Magazine, and Momentum, the magazine for Vanderbilt's Cancer Center. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to begin by asking, if each of you could tell us a little bit about the writing you do for general audiences and why you have chosen to take up this kind of writing.
Okay, I'll start. Okay, might as well start. I've been doing this kind of writing for about 10 years. It started kind of accidentally, I mean, in the sense that I wrote a piece that was historical but was deliberately aimed at public audiences and public events. And I wrote it in a fit of pique. I was angry about something that was happening in public life and had something that I thought the historical knowledge that I had could help advance the conversation in public. And so I wrote this thing and it got published, and then that kind of generated its own momentum. And so generally I write 3,000 to 5,000 word pieces for magazines, online venues, generally using some historical information to shed light on a contemporary debate. And the things I work on relating to war, the U.S.'s presence in the world, immigration, have been arguably in the news a lot over the last decade. And, I've been kind of waiting for occasions where the debate swings in the direction that I actually know something about, and then I try to generate one of these pieces. In terms of, why I do this, and your invitation and questions kind of prompted me to think about, okay, I've been doing this long enough, I should really think about, why do I do this? And it occurred to me there are really a handful of things that come together for me, 5 in particular. So very briefly, one is voice, which is, I like this voice that I get to adopt in this kind of writing, which is very different from an academic form of voice. It reveals more of your humanity as a person who's curious, as a person who is passionate, right? There's a way that all the kind of rhetorical barricades that we established to kind of make sure that everyone knows we're an authority in the academy, you're both required to and allowed to lower those barricades when you write this way. So I like that voice. So it's really, that's partly just aesthetic and just personal. I like speaking in that register. The other is that it's an intellectual challenge. That I think when people talk about writing in this different way, we often don't take for granted that it's basically learning a different language, right? With all the kind of challenges, puzzles to be worked out, apprenticeships that come along with learning a new language. And for me, that was attractive. I'm sort of mid-career, eventually you get good, reasonably good at a confined set of things. They can get a little boring. So having a kind of challenge to kind of, okay, can I make my words do this different thing? Can I make myself speak in this different way? Itself, just as an intellectual process, was really appealing. I like the fact that you get to write in different shapes of writing. So there's something about academic writing where in all of our fields, there's a very confined, rigid set of formats, right? Where it's the academic article, it's the monograph, right? We all know exactly how many words that's supposed to have, how dense that's supposed to be. What I like about these formats is that you can write something short. You don't have to have spent a decade thinking about something. You have to know something. You have to be an authority, ideally, but you get to write in these shorter units. And along with that comes around a faster turnaround time, which, we all have been through peer review, can be very laborious. You can have an idea and only see it get published 5 years down the pike. And so there's something about the appeal of both you could say the shape and the time of these pieces that's very appealing. And then finally, just, two remaining issues, which are more sort of outward facing. One is that I like doing them because I want to achieve some sort of social change. I want to have some sort of intervention in a public debate on an issue that I'm passionate about, right? So this gives me a way to do that in a way that's, far less mediated than putting it in an academic publication where hopefully someone reads it at some point and it shapes somebody's thinking. So that's one part of it, is my desire to kind of influence something. And then finally, and relatedly, there's the question of public responsibility, that I actually feel like as someone who uses society's resources and, someone that, has been the beneficiary of lots of education that lots of people don't have access to, that I have responsibility to share some of what I know with the public. So that's complementary with my desire to achieve social change, but it's coming from the outside. I feel like that's, whether or not I want to, that's kind of incumbent upon me, I feel like, in part to give back to. So
I think my first step toward writing outside the academy wasn't writing, it was public speaking. I'm an astronomer, and lots of people are interested in astronomy, and astronomy is more accessible to the general public than other scientific disciplines. So early on in my career, I'd be invited to elementary schools, to high schools, to talk about a comet, to talk about a solar eclipse, whatever was happening in the sky at the time. And then I attended a big annual meeting of the American Astronomical Society, and Daniel Golden, who was the NASA administrator in the early 90s, was the keynote speaker, and there are 2,000 of us in the room. And he looks at us and he says something similar to what you were talking about. We get our money from you. The public dollars support astronomy, public dollars support NASA. And he said, every one of you needs to be going out and talking to school children once a month. And I looked out around the room and I thought, none of these people should be sent to talk to kids. This would be an unmitigated disaster, right? It'll destroy astronomy because most people are not trained to do it. Most people were not good at doing it. Most people didn't like doing it. I don't know whether I was any good at it early on, but I enjoyed doing it. And I kept getting invited back, so I kept doing it. So I kept doing more and more of it. And of course, I'm a teacher because I'm at Vanderbilt, so I have a lot of experience standing in front of an audience. And then what really kicked me forward was that I was teaching a class about the solar system, and I asked the students what they thought I should be teaching in this course. This was 20 years ago or so. And the students wanted to know whether Pluto was a planet. And there was nothing out there for them to read about it, so I had to start creating a website, early days of web pages as well. And I started creating a pretty thick website with things I collected, and I wrote about it for them. But that forced me, as you said, to write in a different way. When I was writing for my students, that was a very different kind of writing than the professional writing I do for the Astrophysical Journal. And I enjoyed trying to do it. It was a challenge, but I enjoyed trying to do it. And then eventually the book was published. And that, I haven't looked back since then. And I enjoy doing it. But it's hard. It's very, very different.
So I came into science writing because I was majoring in biology, and I was pre-med in college. And then I switched my major to biochemistry, and I worked in the cancer research lab, and I enjoyed writing about science, but I didn't like doing it. So I decided to switch gears, and still got my degree in biology, but started finding ways to present complex scientific ideas to the general public, and that led into my newspaper work. I'd probably still be in newspapers or the news media today were it not for the fact that the news hole for science has shrunk over the last 10 years. And I'm sure as you watch the news, you probably get frustrated at times at how little good science reporting there is out there. And that's because of the management decisions that were made by magazines and TV networks and newspapers over the last few years. So I decided that I could apply my talents better here. And early on, when I first got here, we decided to do a science magazine, a glossy magazine, and there are copies over there if you'd like to look at them. That's 10 years ago, because then the recession of 2008 hit, and there was no money for a glossy magazine, and nobody reads magazines anyway, do they? They're all online now, although they do read books.
Maybe.
Okay. So that's, and I shouldn't have put the dates in the intro because, it makes me sound pretty old, but I'm still here because I still enjoy doing it. And what I do at the medical center is I cover the basic science departments, pharmacology, physiology, cell and developmental biology, pathology, microbiology, and I often have to give myself tutorials before I can even meet with the faculty member and talk about their research and try to translate it in a way that other people can understand. So that's what I do.
I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the lessons to be learned in writing for audiences outside of the academy, and something about what are the benefits of this kind of writing as well.
I'll start it off if you want. One of the things that you learn very quickly is that you have a communication gap. The words that you think clearly express something, your readers have no clue what those words mean. And it's very, very difficult for you as the writer, deeply embedded in that discipline, to know whether your readers will understand what you're trying to tell them. One of the things that I had to learn the hard way was that almost everything I write, I need to put it in front of a lay reader, a lay audience, before submitting it to a journal or submitting it to wherever it's going to be published, because I need some other eyes on what I write to know whether I'm actually communicating something effectively to someone other than myself. You write something and you read something and it sounds great, that doesn't mean it's any good at all. For the audience you're writing to, one of the most critical things I had to learn was how to understand my audience. And to me, that's the biggest failing of most astronomy books. The authors don't know who their audience is. They're writing for themselves rather than for the people who are supposed to be reading the book. But that's a very hard lesson to learn. You get embarrassed a few times.
Yeah, actually, along those lines. So when I was just setting out to do this kind of writing, I apprenticed myself to a group of writers, like professional nonfiction writers, journalists, documentarians who had a workshop. And they were very leery about letting academics in. So I had to make the case that I was like worthy of kind of, and they looked over my academic stuff and they were like, you're right on the edge. Like, we're not sure you're cool enough for us, but we'll like give you a try. And so I wrote up this draft that I thought was going to be like my perfect entree into this group of writers. And I worked really hard to make it non-academic. And I submitted it. And just as you were saying, they came back and said, we told you not to give us something academic. I was like, but this is what I'm, And there was like, you have no idea how much more translation work you have to do.
How many footnotes did you have?
That didn't even have footnotes. It was no footnotes, but it was just the language. It was the jargon, the terminology, all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I would just concur that it's really a discipline. It's something you have to decide you're going to learn to do by study, by reading, and then kind of trying to break down what's working in a popular scholarly piece. So there's something about finding models in your discipline of people that are crossing these lines, and then kind of really studying their work rhetorically, right? To kind of see what they're doing. I mean, I think for me, one useful way to approach this is to think about it as teaching. Going back to your point about, because I think there's a way that we often get hung up around languages of like the public intellectual, right? Or these things where what you're doing is you're inhabiting a role, you're a type of scholar if you do this. And I feel like that gets us into all kinds of binds, right? Where either we romanticize ourselves for doing this, or we punish ourselves if we aren't doing it, but we feel like we should do it, And I feel like there's just it's much healthier to just say, this is teaching, right? And the question is, who are you teaching? Are you teaching your undergraduates and grad students exclusively, or do you want to teach a broader reach of people? Right? And then we have a whole series of skills that we're developing all the time in the classroom for reaching audiences that are non-specialists, right? We do that every day we get in the classroom and try to break down complicated concepts, right, for people that aren't experienced in those fields, right? So I feel like in a way, thinking about this less as public scholarship or kind of, because our classrooms are publics, right? There's nothing not public about being at a university, right? But thinking about it as, a kind of wider horizon of teaching, I think also enlists skills that we already have to reach out and to use different kinds of languages to teach people.
I think from my perspective, one of my biggest challenges is to resist the temptation to over-popularize. So I cover medical science, and trained in newspapers, there was always the tendency from an editor to say, well, isn't this going to be a cure for cancer? Or isn't this a breakthrough? We need these words to catch the reader in the headlines. They think in headlines. And, I don't think I've used the word breakthrough in the past 10 years because it's overused. It's become trash. So how do I engage the reader without giving them what they want, which is an easy answer, something tantalizing or sensational? And one device that I use is metaphors to try and bring down these concepts into lay language. So I've been dealing with, there's a new MRI technique I'm writing about, and it's a 7 Tesla magnet. Well, how do you define Tesla? And, so one source compares a Tesla to 7 times the power of a kitchen magnet or something like that. Well, people can understand kitchen magnets. So I'm looking for those kinds of things that connect to people and bring as another way to bring them into the story.
Do you consider this kind of writing to be particularly important during this time of fake news, or particularly difficult, perhaps?
You want to start this time?
Don't get me started on fake news. I think that we were talking before about the need for perhaps it starts in education, better science education, so that people are prepared and can think critically when they encounter all the cacophony of different voices on social media and in various news outlets, different voices of opinion. This is far from my field, but I think one of the problems is that in the news business, in trying to give a return to shareholders, kind of blurred the distinction between hard news and opinion and entertainment. And so those lines aren't as distinct as they used to be. We may have contributed to the problem. That said, I think that we, as communicators, scientists have an obligation to say, yes, it's a theory. That means it's well established. That does not mean it's somebody's opinion. And that's the kind of thing that we have to emphasize over and over again.
I think we do have a big problem societally, globally, in getting people to distinguish and understand between what is an established scientific fact and what is opinion, and choosing the right words to do that is important. Using the word theory, it's just a disaster to use the word theory because people don't understand the word. One of the biggest problem areas, I would say, in understanding has to do with vaccines and the safety of vaccines. And I think both the media failed that, but the scientists have failed in communicating. The media tends to feel that there's always a need to balance an argument. That's the newspaper thing. That's the TV thing on TV news. If you have a spokesperson for this opinion, you need a spokesperson for this opinion, the opposite. And it isn't necessarily an opinion, so you don't need fair and balanced, right? You just need information. But that's not the way the media tends to work, just historically. I now try pretty hard to avoid those kinds of places where I would write or where I would appear. The television stations contact me and want to interview me, and I refuse because I know they're going to do a terrible job in communicating my message because they're only going to take a snippet of it and then they're going to balance it with something. And I don't want to be part of that. So I choose the media, the paths through which I'm going to communicate, the forums through which I will communicate, so that I can get my message across without having to worry about that. But a lot of that is me not wanting to get my message garbled. And you have to pick and choose.
Yeah, I think this moment does definitely present definite challenges. I mean, I think in a couple of different ways. I mean, one is the assault on, sort of argument and evidence, right, and reasoned debate itself. The other institutionally is that I think we've never seen, at least in my adult lifetime, a kind of assault on the legitimacy of higher education itself as a source of knowledge, right? And if you look at polling about how Americans think about the role of universities in American life, there's been, like, in the last 2 years, like, a nosedive in the number of people that think that universities are worse for the country than better, right? Like, so in terms of just our general legitimacy as participants in an institution that generates certain kinds of knowledge, I feel like we have a role to kind of fight back in that climate, and that's kind of broader set of problems. I think on a more basic level, I feel like we can model a certain kind of deliberative discussion and debate that's where you make arguments. Those arguments you hold accountable to the claims of evidence, and you challenge other people's claims on the basis of evidence. And I mean, I think there's a way that is so under assault right now that if we can participate and through our participation show kind of what that can do and why that's necessary to a democratic society, I think that's a really important role. In terms of my own specific task as a historian, I mean, the work I do is widely understood to be sort of interpretive at its very core. So the question of, I mean, there are historical facts and there are historical non-facts, but a lot of what we do is interpret the past, and that makes it subject to these questions about, is this the right interpretation, right? Is this an ideologically charged interpretation? So on some level, any historical interpretation is, automatically subject to that kind of scrutiny, and should be, I think, subject to that kind of scrutiny. I feel like my role is often to intervene where someone has used a historical argument in a way that is distortive, manipulative, et cetera. Whether they get the facts right or wrong, if they sort of mobilize a set of facts or interpretations in order to make a case that distorts, what historians understand that past to be, that's what I kind of see my role as. And I think there's a number of different maneuvers and operations we can do to take, in a sense, bad history in public and to kind of provide more authoritative, agreed upon histories upon which the citizenry can act in a constructive way. And for me, that's really important, to kind of provide histories that give people interpretations and information that help them make sense of ongoing realities in a way that animates popular agency and participation. So I think that's something that and a lot of historians, among other academics, are doing a lot more of this over the last couple of years. I mean, we've seen this websites, and it's really kind of a heyday for a kind of the humanities and social sciences reaching out with a sense of urgency along these kind of fronts. So.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the kinds of resources that you found to be available for those who are interested in developing their writing skills, writing for audiences outside the academy specifically.
I'm not sure I have a good answer for that. I haven't sought out any particular resources, though I imagine they're probably out there. Maybe Bill has a good idea.
In terms of, if we offer through jointly different avenues for, and I mentor graduate students who would like to do science writing, biomedical science writing. So there are avenues out there. There are some classes that you can hear at Vanderbilt. But I guess maybe some of us are hesitating because I was self-taught. I don't know in terms of...
Yeah, I would describe myself as self-taught, for better or for worse, self-taught. And for those of you who are students here, that's a big problem because right now, both whether you're undergraduates or graduate students, you're being taught to write in a certain way, and you have to perfect that or you're no longer in the academy. And you spend enough years perfecting that skill, and now you're being asked to learn a completely different skill that no one taught you because no one taught us. You have to read what other people are writing. The best lessons I've learned come from reading badly written stuff. And we can all identify that in our own disciplines and what you want to write about. Once you find something and you say, this is terrible, figure out why. And once you know why is terrible, you can figure out, I want to do the opposite. It's like what your parents tell you to do. You do the opposite. So you find the bad article, you do the opposite.
I mean, with me, I saw myself as a student of this, so I really sought out resources. I did not write this way. I had certain impulses that I wanted to write this way, so I kind of really reached out, and I guess part of it was I was living in Boston for a year, and I found this workshop of writers, and I kind of, dutifully attended that. I got humiliated occasionally with my drafts, but learned a lot, and so I think those kind of, apprenticeship relationships you can set up with people, finding other people that are interested in this kind of writing, setting up your own group. I mean, I basically, in my house, a group of friends and colleagues get together once a month, and we read magazine articles and figure out what's working in them. Sometimes we present our own drafts or ideas for drafts, so a supportive community of people that are also, doing this kind of work, and they can bring resources in, so you do this collectively. Reading books, I think, is a really good, I've got a short shelf of books I think are really good on this stuff, mostly by narrative nonfiction writers and journalists. I have this enormous shelf of books that are not so good, but I kind of have within that my treasured chest of books that I think are really great. Podcasts are great. The long form podcast, which is run by these couple of journalists, where they interview nonfiction writers about their practice, and it's especially aimed at journalists about how do you get into the field, how do you get access, these kinds of things. But what you find is that there's a lot of really great information about writing itself that is easily translatable over by writers of all kinds. So I highly recommend the long form podcast as a place of just easy access to some of the leading writers, and they're often people that are not only good writers but very introspective and able to articulate what they're doing effectively. So I've learned a lot from them too.
There are a handful of books out there. I believe the most recent one, I don't have the title or even the authors, but 2014-ish, one of the co-authors, one of the chapter authors teaches a course here for us in the communication of science. And it's the Bible on science writing for people who want to go out and find a book that says, here are the techniques you ought to be using. And if anyone is deeply interested, I could find the title of the book for you.
Thank you. So I'd like to go ahead and open up questions from the audience. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for sharing about this writing to general public. I've heard my professors mention there's this culture of publish or perish within academia, which is, to me, that's a very sad phenomenon when the academic writes more and more abstruse pieces that can only be understood by her very niche academic circle in order to survive retain her job within the academia. So my question is there, my intuition is that the academic actually has a very strong obligation to engage with the general public and contribute to the society. So my question is there a way for us to reform this incentive structure such that we can measure the influence of academic not just by the number of articles that's referenced to the former scholarly pieces, but rather the real influence to engage and benefit the society?
I'm going to tell you that, one, I don't think you'll easily change the structures, though you could try. Okay? Two, no, I don't think people in the academy have an obligation to communicate with the general public. That's not going to help me keep my job. What is going to get me tenure and promoted and continue to get me grants to keep my research going is writing for my colleagues. And as long as, in some fashion, society wants to, through Congress, through NASA, through the National Science Foundation, provide pots of money to which I can apply for grant money to support my research, the only way I'm going to get any money is by writing articles that are peer-reviewed, gain citations by my professional peers in the professional journals. And if none of you ever read a word I write, it wouldn't matter in terms of my career development. Is that wrong? Very possibly, but that's reality. And it's very important to know what reality is before you try to change reality and end up unemployed. So I have not done any of the public writing. I'll just use those words. My writing for the general public was all done after I got tenure and after I got promoted to full professor. If I had invested serious amounts of time in this kind of writing before I gained that level of success in the academy, I would no longer be here to be talking to you about it. That's just the way the academy works. Once I achieved those promotions and once I had tenure, I had more freedom to do what I want to do. I happen to think the kind of writing I'm doing for the public is actually important. And one of the things I'm trying to do in my most recent book, less so than in my previous books, is express an opinion. That's not the typical thing in astronomy. Astronomy is about, here are the facts, ma'am. This is what we know about Jupiter. That's not so much what I'm doing anymore, and part of what I was told by reviewers of my book is I may never get another grant from NASA because of the opinions I've expressed. You can't do that unless you're safe and secure in knowing you'll still have a paycheck next week. And again, the basic premise, I think, of part of your question being that I have an obligation to communicate to the public. I don't think there's anybody in this university who is involved in making sure I have a job who thinks that's true.
Yeah, and I think your question, if I can just jump in, gets at really the institutional crux of this. I feel like it's an absolutely central question because there's only limited time and resources, right? And the question of, and this is time and labor-intensive work, right? So it's going to take time away from academic publishing at a time when, with teaching and institutional responsibilities in a new job, your time is already very compressed. And so I think, the challenge though is that if so my advice would also be to play it safe in general and not to overdo it early in one's career with this kind of work, because you won't get institutional credit for it, and you may even get negative credit, because I think depending on how much academic publishing you do, if anyone on a tenure committee has a reason to suspect you don't have enough academic material, and they also know you've done a lot of public work, that will be the narrative, right? that he or she could have been doing more peer-reviewed articles, but instead they publish blog posts, magazine pieces, right? Whether that's true or not, that is available as a narrative that can jeopardize your career. So I think in terms of the pragmatics, the political pragmatics of this, I recommend taking it easy early in one's career. Now, I think the reason I don't recommend not doing it, right, for junior people is that I feel like if you wait that, 6-7 years early in one's career to participate in this world at all, you're not going to do it probably. Or in other words, there's ways that patterns in one's career and behavior and skills tend to crystallize in some important ways in that early period. And so I feel like if it's something that you know you want to do, keeping a toe in that world, right, or just establishing a tiny sort of footprint in that world early on, just to get the flavor of it in a way that doesn't take time away from the stuff that's going to keep you employed, but also doesn't stifle the impulse, right, which is also part of what happens. Part of what this institution is meant to do is to socialize us away from this kind of activity through these incentive structures, right? And so I think that bucking those a little bit in a way that doesn't jeopardize your larger trajectory, but also, doesn't squash that impulse can be really important. But I agree that it's going to be very hard to change the institutional structures. And I know because I've asked, a series of, universities that I've worked for while I've been doing this work, like, hey, can I get points for this? And, deans and provosts and, their eyes glaze over. They don't want to, it's not a metric they respect or understand. I mean, the irony being that they like the notoriety and the fame that comes with somebody who's in public. So they want you to be out there kind of putting your institution's name on websites that kind of, and they build an infrastructure, a media system within the university to help get those out. But when it comes to promotion or tenure, you won't get any credit for it at all. So there is a kind of contradiction there.
Yeah, some really good points there. I think the institution, Vanderbilt, not any different from other major universities, they want to see my name in the New York Times. They want to see me quoted as an expert in the New York Times. They don't want to see me as the author of the article in the New York Times, right? There's a big difference. And I think you're right, keeping your toe in the water is very important. At the same time, if you don't survive as an academic and establish your reputation as an expert in your field, then you don't have a platform to stand on to speak to the public. So you have to establish that your professional credentials as strongly as possible, which means burying yourself in the ivory tower and writing for your colleagues, not for the public, until you have that platform, until you have those credentials. And then someone might listen to you. So there's a balance here.
So there is one element that may be a way out of this conundrum. We are a medical center news office. We work with faculty who are publishing papers all the time, and sometimes they will contact us and say, I've got a paper coming out in Cell or Structure that's pretty interesting. I think the public would be interested in it. Would you help me publicize it? So, and these are often assistant professors. They're starting their career. So we will draft a news release, an article, they will approve it, and then our national news director will say, well, I'm not just going to pitch this to anybody. I know some reporters at the Wall Street Journal and New York Times who are interested in this field. I will give them an exclusive on this. And oftentimes that is an indirect way, but that's a way of fulfilling your desire to get your message out to the public by using the resources of the university press office. And they can also help you control the message because they're targeting specific reporters.
Until listening to Bill provide that answer, I hadn't realized something myself, and that is that one of the ways I actually learned how to do the writing I do is from a former science writer here at Vanderbilt, David Salisbury. So early in my career, I was not writing for the public, but I was going to our science office, to a professional journalist science writer who had real training in this, and he would write up things about what I had done, and I'd read what he'd written, and I'd say, that's not right, and we'd go back and forth and correct it, but he was trying to get it into the language the public could understand. And there were a large number of project that David Salisbury did with me that I think was an important part of my education as a writer.
I mean, one way to balance this, particularly early in one's career, would be to actually think about it as a hobby, right? In other words, to not think of it, to think, well, okay, I've got this set of skills, and, within this institutional context, my job is to publish peer-reviewed articles of a certain number and length and density in the right journals, right, to jump through those hoops. But the fact that I have that knowledge doesn't go away when I go home. It doesn't go away when I read the newspaper or when I engage public life. Like, I have a broader set of social roles that are going to be informed by all of this stuff I've been learning, right? And to think of it as a hobby that you do part-time, right? Like hobbies, you don't let them overtake your main career, right? And the other thing is you don't necessarily have to tell your colleagues about them either, right? I think when it comes to this question about creating a narrative in which, you are a responsible, productive, self-disciplined academic climbing the tenure ladder, given that we know we're not going to get academic credit for these things, you don't have to put them on your CV. Anyone who Googles you may find them if there's a tenure board or some review committee, but they may have to go out of their way to do that. And so I feel like there's a way that maybe part of the solution to this is to actually kind of, in a way, partition our voices or our kind of participation in a way that allows the public to have some access to the knowledge we have, but we just decide that we're going to have to get enough done on the academic side of the ledger and try to get credit for that we're not even going to try to get our op-eds and other kinds of participation, but that's just something that we want to do for some other reason, right? And I think that as long as we keep the time and energy balance in play in a way that doesn't jeopardize the academic side, I think that can be a way that in a way it just establishes a kind of clear division in your own sense of your writing.
One thing I've become more certain about as I've helped writers for the last 15 years or so is that it helps a lot to teach writers to read for structure, not just for reading. And I wonder how your structure, the argumentative structure, narrative structure, syntactical structure changes when you do different types of writing. And this is maybe a corollary to that question. What about visual images? Haven't they come into writing in the academic stuff that you do and the public stuff that you do?
I'll say that, for me, structure is really central to the narrative writing I do, and kind of thinking. In fact, I'm starting to develop a course I'm teaching next fall on narrative nonfiction writing, and so I'm running it as a kind of tutorial with a single student, and we did a unit on structure, and I've realized we're going to have to do 3 weeks on structure because it's so important, and I feel like it's entirely different in the sense that what I've got to do in kind of non-required reading, right? When I think about someone who the easiest thing for a reader to do is to either not read what I've published or to read 2 sentences and drop it, and do something else, right? Particularly if they're reading it online where there's, lots of things buzzing at them, right? So making sure that you've got a strong opener, right, that kind of grabs them and that tells them what the piece is going to be about and why they should care about it. Thinking about it in terms of a thematic through line, if it's going to be a narrative piece, like who are my characters. So I really think about it in terms of, a plot, rising action, a lot of those kind of pieces. That's when I'm writing a more narrative piece, but even when I'm writing a more argumentative piece, I try to think about how am I holding the reader's attention? How am I creating a certain kind of narrative momentum? What am I revealing? What am I concealing? Right? In a way that the reader is going to want to solve the puzzle that I'm establishing, right? So the sense that I've got to create a certain kind of impulse through the text, which you can't presume, or you don't really necessarily need in an academic publication because the person reading it has some other kind of inherent interest, right? Either like they're your competitor, right? So they want to know, like, what has this person written in this academic journal, right? They're a grad student who's studying for their exams, right? There are all these pressures on them to keep reading. So it can be, people appreciate good academic writing, but they're going to read it anyway because they've got other motivations, right? But in this kind of writing, you have to think about structure because you have to think about the reader, right? And building the reader that you're trying to approach into the way that you tell the story from the beginning. So, absolutely.
The question about structure is a good one for a professional article I would write for other astronomers. It almost doesn't matter how well or badly it's written, and they're actually almost never going to read it starting at the beginning. And you asked about illustrations, figures. The first thing I would do in opening up a professional article is start looking at the illustrations and reading the figure captions. That's the meat and potatoes. The article itself, the words themselves in the text, is enhancing that. And if I don't get enough excitement, knowledge from looking at the illustrations and looking at a graph and understanding there's some serious stuff there that I want to know about, I'm not going to read the rest of it. And if I do read the rest of it, it just doesn't matter how it's structured. I have to read it. When I'm writing for the non-professional audience, there are almost never any figures to begin with, okay? And I will lose them after the first sentence or before the end of the first sentence unless I've done something to engage them. It's a completely different kind of writing. One of the best things I learned was from someone who was here on campus for a couple years, and she taught a science writing course for me in the communication science program. And she took a film studies course here at Vanderbilt, just audited the film studies course. And she said she learned more from doing that than from any of the writing she'd done or any of the writing training she'd had. That in a movie, you don't go to a movie that's 2.5 hours long and it's one long crescendo and then one long fall off. You're gone. You're not watching the movie. It's up and down, and it's up and down, and it's up and down. More like newspaper writing. You've got to keep the reader excited and engaged in it. It's just completely different than the academic writing I would do.
Just extend that and ask, what is, newspapers do rely on photographs often to keep your attention.
True. But
and I guess, what is the trick to finding the hook or the narrative in the photo, and then using that to propel the article?
Well, I think that often this happenstance. I mean, you have news events, and if you happen to have a photographer there that captures the right image, then you're pretty fortunate, and that goes on the front page. If you don't have a photographer there, then there is the basic newspaper structure, and you've all heard it, the who, what, when, where, and why in the first paragraph. And actually, the other structure is the inverted pyramid. Everything you need to know in the first 5 paragraphs, knowing that most people stop reading and go on to the next article after 5 paragraphs. And so that's the hook, that's the use of visual imagery, and if you're lucky enough to have a photograph, the photograph in a newspaper will pull people to the story. Will it keep them in the story? I don't know,
I think a different kind of imagery, which for most of the writing I've done is more important than I think what you're thinking of as an image, is the title of the article. That's an image. And people read the title of the article or the title of the chapter, and they either start reading or they don't. Now, for a book, the cover of the book is incredibly important because they open it up. But if they look at the table of contents and the chapter titles sound boring, they're not going any further. If they get past the chapter titles and they get to the first chapter and the first sentence isn't drawing them in, they're not going any further. So there's some imagery there, but it's the image of words.
Yeah. Can I ask you one other follow-up? So I'm interested in that voice that you like better. And you say that you don't use as much jargon when you're writing for the public, but how do the sentences look different? How is their structure different? Are they shorter, or what's different?
Yeah, I think along multiple dimensions. I mean, I think they're shorter. I think that the sentence structure, in terms of the flow of them, I'm much more self-conscious about, not beginning with long, dense clauses, right? Kind of sticking with like forceful, forward-moving sentence structures that, really thinking about friction within sentences and how do you kind of remove the kind of grit out of a sentence sentence so that semantically and sonically, right, that it's got to sound good, right? Like all this is going to kind of work in at the sentence level. So jargon is certainly a part of it, but there's all kinds of other things about active verbs, kind of getting rid of sort of.
It's easier to do when you have characters.
What's that? Yeah, exactly. So I feel like the sentences in my kind of nonfiction pieces are really different. I mean, one of the side benefits of doing this kind of writing is that I think it ends up informing your academic writing. I mean, I think that there's a way that, even though I'm sort of arguing for conceptualizing this kind of writing in a separate bin potentially, at least professionally, ultimately when you start thinking about what makes a better versus a worse sentence, that's gonna make your academic prose better, right? And I feel like I definitely kind of feel that's happened too. That I think that there's a measurable difference between the stuff I'm publishing in academic journals versus in more public venues, but it's not as wide a gap as there was 10 years ago, where I think there it was like a really radical shift, whereas I feel like there's more of a blending in the middle in terms of some of the lessons that I've learned about putting sentences together.
There's another shift that's happened for me because there's another kind of writing we do. My emails. I write emails differently now because I've learned to write shorter, more precise sentences, and that communicates what I want to communicate better. My memos that go across campus, I know I write them differently now, and I know they're better because I've learned how to communicate in a different way. And a lot of it has to do with simplifying the sentences, shortening the sentences, fewer commas, fewer semicolons, get the message across.
Can I ask one more question? So this was wonderful. Thank you all. One of the big takeaways for me is these mentor relationships, right? I mean, you saying that you do that, you realizing that was part of your early, self-teaching and your apprenticeship, Paul. I guess I wonder what advice you'd give to anybody in this room who wanted to approach someone, to be their mentor in that way.
Just do it. I think it'd be. I doubt anybody would refuse if the request were genuine, and if you came with something and said, "I don't think this is right. Can you help me?" I think people would say yes. But the burden is on the writer to ask to find the mentor.
One of the things we do with my mentors is we have a little briefs about scientific papers in the Reporter called aliquots, and the maximum length is 160 words. So the people that I work with have to learn how to condense really dense papers into 160 words, and that is a lesson in learning how to write spare and succinctly.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, reaching out, right? Reaching out to people that they're doing this kind of writing. And, as was being said, I mean, there'll be people that don't have time or the inclination, but there will be people who do. And I think, also for people for whom this was a hard-won skill, I feel like, at least for me, like, I'm very eager to pass this along because it was challenging to develop, and I'm very grateful to the mentoring I received. And it's one of these where I really just see, paying it forward as being, something I want to do. So, and there are lots of degrees of mentoring too. I mean, there's the kind of read this draft, give me comments, which is very labor intensive. But there's also the kind of, here are the steps I took. Here are a couple of books. I feel like it's there's lots of degrees and lots of different needs too, right? Where people are going to have different needs for mentoring in that respect. But I feel like that's a important first step, because I think one of the challenges I think in this is that it feels like there is a huge institutional gulf between the university and this other kind of writing. At least I know that before I started to do this, and even after the first couple of pieces, and even now where I've done a fair number of them, it still feels like every time I head in that direction, it's like there's a cliff on the other side, right, that I'm kind of trying to cross, and so I think finding people that that can both help you figure out how to move back and forth, and who also may diminish your sense of that abyss in between, right? Can be very, very helpful. But I feel like for me, finding people that inhabit that role between the academy and someplace else, just as a way of envisioning your own possible role, for me that was very important. So.
Thank you for the great discussion. One question I would have is, what advice would you give to a student who has an idea for an article or short piece that you want to put publicly, not actually sure where, but you have an idea of a piece of combining some academic knowledge with a current debate? What advice do you have for trying to find an outlet or someone who's willing to publish or post it?
That's a challenge, because a lot of places where you might think your piece would be well placed are not open to you. They have their in-house writers and they don't accept unsolicited pieces. So you have to be a consumer of information. You have to know what's out there so that you can start finding places that you think might be appropriate. You can always, if you're not looking to get paid, and most of the stuff I've written I haven't gotten paid for, you can always now just create your own blog. And if you've got enough Facebook contacts or Twitter contacts, etc., you can get the word out. And if a few people read it and they pass it on, then suddenly a lot of people are reading what you've written. I think that's a powerful way to get started now.
Yeah, that seems to be an on-ramp that wasn't there, not that long ago, where, if you attract people to the stuff you're writing, then you may be able to find an avenue because one of those editors may, see your stuff and say, hey, this person should be writing for us. Getting in the door is very, very hard. I think that's, in a way, one of the kind of largely unspoken challenges in all this is, there's the challenge of, where do I get the time? And there's the challenge of, can I learn to reconfigure my language to do this, right? But then there's I've got something, right? It's the right length, it's topical, it's well researched, right? And then you just have to bang on a huge number of doors, right? And you have to just be willing to. It's not even that you get rejections. Nobody takes the time to actually email you a rejection. You just never hear from these websites, or you just send these things out. And so the mentors I've had in this have even people that are very famous and accomplished have been really generous with me in just reinforcing that they get rejected, at a level of prominence that I'll never hope to achieve. I think I pitched a piece recently 30 times and nothing. And I emailed one of my writing coaches and was just like, does this ever happen, to you? And he was like, oh yeah, it's this piece that I haven't been able to publish that I'm thinking, okay, if you've been at this for as long as you have, and he said basically the secret is persistence, where you've got to, and what I found is that if you, one kind of easy first step is to kind of look at what you're reading, right? So in other words, when you had an idea for this kind of piece, presumably there are journals or websites that you're reading that are inspiring this, thinking okay, so those are the natural places to pitch, right? Where people who have my kind of expertise, who write in the same way that I do on this topic, are publishing, right? So there's a track that's already available, right? You're not having to kind of invent the wheel there. It can really help to develop a relationship with a specific editor. That's my experience. When you pitch something to the general website, they call it the slush pile, and they call it that for a reason. There's usually an intern whose job it is to read through thousands of proposals, and I don't think I've ever had anything accepted from the slush pile. It's been basically someone I know who knows an editor, someone who's written for that venue, who gives me the personal email address of that editor. And then, maybe they get back to you, maybe they don't. Maybe they say yes or they don't, or they give you suggestions, but it's that, that's a much more reliable path to getting in one of these venues, really, than any other. And then what I found is that if you work well with that editor, and it's really important to establish a really positive first working relationship, they'll come back to you. Or what I found is that when I have worked with an editor on a piece, they don't accept, everything that I pitch them, but I will hear back from them promptly with a no, and maybe some constructive criticism, and maybe they'll take my second or third pitch. So I feel like it's one of these things where it takes a lot of knocking on doors, but if you establish a couple of working relationships with the editors, it gets a lot easier on that front with persistence.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and experience of writing for general audiences with us. And before you go, I do want to tell you about one of our events coming up. The Writing Studio is having a writing symposium, and it celebrates undergraduate writing, and that happens this Sunday, March 25th from 2 to 5 p.m. in the John Siegenthaler Center. And there's still refreshments available, I think, so please do help yourselves, and thank you again very much.
Thank you.